I grew up in what most people would call an average family, the younger of two sisters. My father was always busy with his work as an entrepreneur, constantly traveling for his company, his crisp suits and briefcase a constant reminder of his frequent absences, while my mother stayed at home with us. From my earliest memories, it was clear who the favorite child was. My older sister was the spitting image of our mother, not just in looks, with the same honey blonde hair and delicate features, but in personality too. Mom doted on her endlessly, while I was a constant reminder of someone she despised, her mother-in-law. I had the same dark hair, the same strong jaw, and the same determined set to my shoulders that I would later see in old photographs of my grandmother. I'd often overhear Mom complaining to her friends during their regular coffee mornings in our kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries would drift upstairs where I was cleaning the bathrooms, along with their sharp voices and sharper laughter. "Can you believe that woman?" Mom would say, her voice dripping with contempt as she sat at our granite kitchen island, perfectly manicured nails wrapped around her coffee cup. "She has the nerve to call me a slacker. As if raising 2 children isn't work enough." Then she'd launch into one of her tirades, calling my grandmother a crazy old woman and an old witch. I'd shrink into myself whenever I heard these conversations, knowing I carried my grandmother's features on my face. While Dad was away on his frequent business trips, sometimes lasting weeks at a time, Mom made it crystal clear what my role in the family was. She'd stand in the doorway of my room, arms crossed, surveying the space like a military inspector. "Melanie, clean up these toys," she'd order, pointing to the mess both my sister and I had made during our rare moments of playing together. "And don't forget to put away the laundry after. I want those sheets folded properly this time, not like the sloppy job you did yesterday." I was barely tall enough to reach the shelves in the linen closet, but that wasn't considered an excuse. When I was 8, during a particularly exhausting day of cleaning under the living room furniture, I finally worked up the courage to ask why my sister never had to help with any housework. The words had barely left my mouth when I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. "Because your sister is smart," Mom snapped, her eyes flashing with anger as she loomed over me. She grabbed my chin roughly, forcing me to look at her. "She doesn't need to work with her hands. You're stupid, so you need to learn how to work from an early age. Or do you want to end up as useless as your grandmother?" That set the pattern for the next few years. By the time I was 9, I had become their full-time housekeeper and maid whenever Dad was away. Mom and my sister would regularly leave me alone in the house while they went shopping, to dinner, or to see movies. I'd watch from the living room window as they pulled out of the driveway in Mom's shiny SUV, chatting and laughing together like best friends. Despite being barely tall enough to reach the stove, I was expected to have dinner ready when they returned and keep the house spotless. I still remember standing on a wobbly kitchen chair, trying to stir pasta in a pot that seemed impossibly large, terrified of both burning myself and incurring Mom's wrath if dinner wasn't ready on time. The sound of Dad's car pulling into the driveway always triggered an amazing transformation in our house. Mom would suddenly turn into this perfect housewife, bustling around the kitchen with flour on her cheeks, the smell of fresh-baked cookies filling the air. It was like watching a master actress take the stage. "Oh honey, you're home." She'd greet him with a weary smile, somehow managing to look both perfect and exhausted at the same time. "I'm just so tired. We really need some help, a babysitter, maybe a housekeeper? I can barely keep up anymore." Dad, feeling guilty about his long absences, would immediately pull out his checkbook. "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need." He'd write checks for household help that never materialized, money that would mysteriously transform into designer clothes and spa days for Mom and my sister. Those precious days when Dad was home were like brief vacations from my usual life. Mom would cook elaborate meals herself, scrub the bathrooms until they sparkled, and actually fold her own laundry. Best of all, nobody yelled at me or called me stupid. I could just be a kid, doing my homework or reading a book without constant interruptions for chores. But the peace never lasted. Mom made sure I understood what would happen if I ever told Dad the truth about our life when he was away. "You see how your father never speaks to his mother anymore?" she'd whisper to me late at night, cornering me in my bedroom. "That could be you. One word from me, and he'll abandon you just like he abandoned her. Is that what you want?" The threat worked perfectly. I lived in constant fear that Mom would turn Dad against me, that one day he'd look at me with the same disgust she did. So I cleaned and cooked and kept my mouth shut, watching as the money Dad left for household help was spent on shopping sprees and salon visits for Mom and my sister. "Look at this gorgeous dress I got your sister," Mom would exclaim, pulling designer clothes from shopping bags while I wore whatever my sister had outgrown or rejected. "Oh, Melanie, you can have her old blue sweater. It doesn't fit her anymore." The worst part was how Mom would look at me sometimes, her lip curling with disgust. "God, you look more like her every day," she'd mutter, referring to my grandmother. Same stubborn chin, same judgmental look. That mysterious grandmother of mine existed only in old photographs I'd found in a dusty box in our attic. I'd sometimes sneak up there just to look at them, wondering about this woman who shared my features. In one yellowed photo, she was smiling, holding a baby I assumed was my father. She didn't look like a witch or a monster, she looked kind. Unlike my father's mother, who was just a mysterious figure in old photographs, I actually knew my maternal grandparents. I almost wish I hadn't. They lived just across town in a beautiful house with a garden full of roses, but their hearts might as well have been made of thorns when it came to me. "Look who's here," they would exclaim whenever my sister walked through their door, showering her with hugs and kisses. Then their eyes would fall on me, and the temperature in the room would drop 10 degrees. "Oh, hello, Melanie." They looked at me like I was something unpleasant they'd found on the bottom of their shoes. Mom had poisoned their minds against me long before I could even defend myself. "You won't believe what she did this time," Mom would say during our visits, her voice thick with fake tears. "She broke that expensive vase you gave us. Just knocked it right over, probably on purpose." The vase had actually been knocked over by my sister during one of her running games, but Mom had already decided which version of the story to tell. My grandparents would shake their heads and cluck their tongues. "Such a difficult child," Grandma would say, as if I wasn't sitting right there. "She looks more like that woman every day." That woman. Always that woman. My father's mother cast a shadow over both sides of my family. Every minor mistake I made was transformed into a major catastrophe for my grandparents' benefit. A spilled glass of milk became willful destruction of property. A wrong answer on my homework became proof of my rebellion against authority. "Come here, Sarah, darling," Grandma would say, deliberately turning away from me. "We're planning a trip to the beach next weekend. Would you like to come?" My sister would bounce with excitement while I sat in the corner, already knowing what was coming. "Melanie can't come," Grandpa would add sternly, not even looking in my direction. "She's being punished for her behavior." I was only 10 years old, watching my sister pack her little suitcase for yet another fun weekend with the grandparents while I stayed home. "You're being punished for disobedience," they'd tell me, though I followed every rule, cleaned every mess, and did everything I was told. The worst part was the physical affection they lavished on my sister while treating me like I was contagious. They would deliberately avoid hugging me, turning their cheeks away if I tried to kiss them hello. The message was clear: I was unwanted, unworthy of their love. Just like her grandmother, they'd whisper when they thought I couldn't hear. "God help our daughter, having to raise such a difficult child." And so my world grew smaller and smaller, confined to a house where I was a servant and family gatherings where I was a ghost, watching from the sidelines as everyone else shared love and laughter that I wasn't allowed to be part of. As I entered my teenage years, Mom's demands grew exponentially. The list of daily chores became impossibly long: vacuum every room, dust all surfaces, scrub the bathrooms, mop the floors, do the laundry, clean the windows, prepare meals. It was like she was testing my breaking point. "These windows are streaky, Melanie," she'd scream, inspecting my work with a critical eye. "Do them again. And look at these baseboards, disgusting. Were you raised in a barn?" I'd redo everything, my hands raw from cleaning products, my back aching from bending and scrubbing. But it was never good enough. There was always something wrong, always a reason for punishment, privileges revoked, extra chores added, harsh words that cut deeper than any physical pain could. The only light at the end of this dark tunnel was my dream of college. I'd lie in bed at night, exhausted from the day's labor, and imagine myself in a dormitory far away from this house. Freedom. Independence. A life where I could just be a student, not a servant. I held on to this dream like a lifeline. But even that dream was being threatened. Between all the housework, I could barely keep my eyes open during classes, let alone focus on studying. My grades started slipping, not dramatically, but enough to give Mom ammunition. When Dad returned from his latest business trip, Mom was ready with her performance. "I'm so worried about Melanie," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "She's become so lazy lately. Her teachers called, she's falling behind in her classes. I think she just doesn't care about her education." Dad looked at me with disappointment that felt like a knife in my chest. "Is this true, Melanie? You're not studying?" Before I could defend myself, Mom jumped in. "Show him your last math test, Melanie. Show him what happens when you don't apply yourself." The C+ on my math test might as well have been a failing grade in our household. Dad's face darkened. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly. "You need to take your studies seriously. No new phone until your grades improve." Something snapped inside me at that moment. All the years of unfairness, of being treated like a slave while my sister lived like a princess, of watching Mom spend the money meant for my care on herself, it all boiled over. "But Dad, you don't understand," I started, ready to tell him everything. Mom's hand gripped my arm like a vice, pulling me into the kitchen while Dad went upstairs to unpack. "Listen carefully," she hissed, her nails digging into my skin. "You remember what happened to your grandmother? How your father hasn't spoken to her in years? One word from me, and that'll be you. Is that what you want? To be abandoned by your father completely?" Her eyes were cold and calculating. "Who do you think he'll believe? His loving wife who's raised his children while he's away, or his disobedient daughter who can't even maintain decent grades? If you say anything, I'll make sure he never pays for your college. You'll be stuck here forever. Is that what you want?" The fight drained out of me like water down a drain. The thought of losing my only chance at escape, of my father turning against me completely like he had with his own mother, it was too terrifying to risk. So I swallowed my words along with my pride. "No, Mom. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "Good girl," she said, patting my cheek with mock affection. "Now go clean the garage. It's filthy." And just like that, my almost rebellion was crushed before it could begin, buried under the weight of fear and the endless list of chores that awaited me. It was a Friday afternoon when my sister's friends invaded our house like a swarm of locusts. Mom had ordered a feast for them, stacks of pizza boxes, bags of burgers, bottles of soda, and enough sweets to stock a small candy store. The smell of food filled the house while I stood in the corner, my stomach growling. I knew better than to expect any of it would be for me. "Melanie," Mom called out in her sweetest voice, the one she used when she wanted to appear like a caring mother in front of others. "Come help serve the food to Sarah's friends." I moved between the groups of teenagers, setting out plates and napkins, while they sprawled across our living room furniture, dropping chips and tracking mud on the carpet I'd cleaned that morning. The afternoon dragged on endlessly. Every time I cleaned up one mess, they created 3 more. Pizza sauce on the couch, crushed chips ground into the carpet, sticky soda spills everywhere. And through it all, their mocking laughter, encouraged by my sister and ignored by my mother. When they finally left, well after dark, the house looked like it had been hit by a tornado. I was already exhausted, but Mom wasn't finished with me yet. "This place is a disaster," she shrieked, surveying the damage. "Look at these stains. You call this cleaning? Do it all again, and do it properly this time." "But Mom," I protested weakly, "I have a big history test tomorrow. I haven't had any time to study." "Not my problem," she snapped. "You should have cleaned better the first time. Now get to work." I spent the next several hours deep cleaning every inch of the house. By the time I finally crawled into bed, it was past midnight. My history textbook sat unopened on my desk, mocking me with its presence. The next morning, desperate and exhausted, I arrived at school early to find Mrs. Bennett, my history teacher. She was always kind to me, one of the few adults who seemed to notice something wasn't quite right. Mrs. Bennet, I said, my voice shaking, I couldn't prepare for today's test. I had to clean the house all day yesterday and all night. My sister had friends over and... The words tumbled out, years of pent-up frustration breaking through my usual careful silence. Mrs. Bennet's face grew increasingly concerned as I spoke. Without warning, she picked up her phone and dialed my mother's number, putting it on speaker. Mrs. Parker? This is Mrs. Bennet, Melanie's history teacher. I'm concerned because Melanie tells me she couldn't prepare for today's test because she was cleaning the house all day and night? My mother's response was immediate and sickeningly sweet. Oh, Mrs. Bennet, I'm so sorry about this. The truth is, Melanie is, well, she's rather lazy when it comes to her studies. She had plenty of time to prepare but chose not to. You know how teenagers can be with their excuses. I stood there, my face burning with shame and anger, as my mother effortlessly painted me as the villain. But when I looked up, I saw something in Mrs. Bennet's eyes I hadn't expected: suspicion. After hanging up, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small black device. Melanie, she said quietly, pressing the dictaphone into my hand, I want you to record what happens at home. Everything. Can you do that for me? My hands were shaking as I pressed the record button on the dictaphone the moment I walked through our front door. I slipped the small device into my uniform pocket, praying it would pick up everything clearly. I didn't have to wait long for Mom to start her usual afternoon routine. Where the hell have you been? She screamed, storming into the entryway. I got a call from your teacher today. How dare you tell her about cleaning the house? Are you trying to make me look bad? She grabbed my backpack and threw it across the room, scattering my books. If you ever complain to your teachers again, I'll make your life even more miserable than it already is. Now clean this mess up. The afternoon unfolded like any other, a constant stream of orders, insults, and threats, all being recorded in secret. I cleaned bathrooms, mopped floors, and dusted furniture while Mom followed behind, criticizing every move. You call that clean? My God, you're as useless as your grandmother. As evening approached, Mom's threats took a darker turn. She cornered me in the kitchen while I was preparing dinner. You know what? She hissed, leaning close. If you step out of line again, I'll tell your father you've been stealing money from his wallet. I'll tell him I caught you drinking alcohol in your room. I stirred the pasta sauce with trembling hands, saying nothing, knowing the dictaphone was catching every word. But the real revelation came just before bedtime. Mom was in one of her boastful moods, glass of wine in hand, seemingly proud of her manipulative achievements. You know why your father doesn't speak to his mother anymore, she said, settling into her favorite armchair. Because I'm smarter than all of you. I told him she threatened me, that she was trying to destroy our family. Your father bought every word. That old witch never knew what hit her. She laughed, taking another sip of wine. And I can do the same to you, Melanie. One word from me, and your father will throw you out just like he did his mother. Remember that next time you think about complaining to your teachers. The next morning, I practically ran to school, the dictaphone feeling like it was burning a hole in my pocket. Mrs. Bennet was already in her classroom when I arrived. I got it all, I whispered, placing the device on her desk. Mrs. Bennet closed the classroom door and pressed play. As my mother's voice filled the room, the screaming, the threats, the cruel laughter, the confession about my grandmother, I watched my teacher's face change. Tears welled up in her eyes as she listened, her hand covering her mouth in horror. When the recording finally ended, she didn't speak for a long moment. Then she stood up and did something no adult had done in years. She hugged me, tight and protective. Oh, Melanie, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I am so sorry you've been going through this alone. But you're not alone anymore. I promise you, we're going to figure this out. I'm going to help you. It happened a few days later. The front door crashed open with such force that the pictures rattled on the walls. Dad stood in the doorway, his face a storm of anger I'd never seen before. He was supposed to be away on business for another week, yet here he was, his usual polished appearance disheveled, his eyes blazing. Mom jumped up from the couch, her face draining of color. "James? What are you doing home? I know everything." His voice was deadly quiet. "Everything about how you've been treating our daughter." Mom's eyes darted to me, then back to Dad. "What lies has she been telling you? You know how she makes things up." "Lies?" Dad pulled out his phone. "Let's talk about lies, Sharon." The sound of Mom's own voice filled the room, her screaming, her threats, her cruel laughter. The blood drained from her face as she recognized her own words about making Dad abandon me, about using me as a servant. That's taken out of context," she stammered, backing away. "Context?" Dad's laugh was bitter. "Like the context of how you turned me against my own mother? How you've been stealing the money I sent for Melanie's care." More recordings played, Mom bragging about her manipulations, about getting pregnant with me just to avoid work, about using Dad as her money bag. "You're a monster," Dad said, his voice shaking with rage. "I'm divorcing you, and I'm filing for full custody of Melanie. You'll never hurt her again." He turned to me, his voice softening. "Pack your things, sweetheart. We're leaving." Everything after that happened in a blur. I threw clothes into bags while Dad gathered his things, Mom's hysterical protests echoing through the house. Within an hour, we were in Dad's car, driving away from the only home I'd known. The apartment Dad had rented was small but clean, with 2 bedrooms and a tiny kitchen. As soon as we got inside, Dad pulled me into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry, Melanie," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have seen it. I should have protected you. But I promise, no one will ever hurt you like that again." The next morning, we drove to a modest house on the outskirts of town. My heart was pounding as we walked up the path. I knew this was my grandmother's house, though I'd never been here before. The door opened, and there she was, the woman from those old photographs. Her eyes found mine immediately, and I saw her own face reflected in mine. Without a word, she opened her arms, and I fell into them like I'd been waiting my whole life for this hug. "My girl," she whispered, holding me tight. "My precious girl." Dad broke down then, apologizing through tears for believing the lies, for cutting her out of our lives. Grandmother listened as he explained everything, the recordings, Mom's manipulation, how she'd used me as a servant while stealing the money meant for my care. "I should have told you years ago," Grandmother said quietly, leading us to her cozy living room. "Your wife," she told me straight out what she was planning. "Said you were her money bag, and she'd spend whatever she wanted." When I confronted her about not working, she laughed in my face and said she'd get pregnant again just to avoid it. "She said she'd turn you against me," Grandmother continued, "and make sure you never saw your grandchildren. I tried to warn you, James, but by then she'd already poisoned you against me. Then she got pregnant with Melanie." The divorce proceedings moved quickly. Dad's lawyer was ruthless, armed with the recordings and documentation of Mom's financial deceptions. In the end, everything was split down the middle, the house, the cars, the savings. Mom tried to argue for more, but her own recorded confessions of stealing money meant for my care weakened her position considerably. Dad and I moved into a new house, smaller than our old one but filled with warmth instead of fear. No more hand-me-downs, no more making do with whatever my sister rejected. Sarah's reaction to everything was predictably dramatic. She sided completely with Mom, of course. "How could you do this to us?" she screamed at Dad over the phone. "You kicked us out of our home. You destroyed our family." "Your mother destroyed this family," Dad replied calmly, "the day she decided to abuse your sister and turn her into a servant." Sarah hung up and blocked his number. Sometimes I catch Dad looking at her picture, sadness in his eyes, but he never regrets choosing to protect me. The worst call came about a week after we moved. I was doing homework, actually having time to study was still a novel concept, when my phone rang. It was my maternal grandparents. "You ungrateful little witch," Grandma spat. "You've ruined everything. We should have known you'd be trouble the day you were born. Everything would have been better if you'd never existed." I was frozen, the phone shaking in my hand, when Dad walked in. One look at my face and he knew something was wrong. He took the phone and put it on speaker just in time to hear Grandpa calling me names that made my eyes water. Listen carefully, Dad's voice was steel. Every call to this number is recorded. If you ever contact my daughter again with your abuse, I will take you to court faster than you can blink. She's been hurt enough by this family. It stops now. The next day, Dad took me to my first therapy session. Dr. Martinez was kind and patient, helping me understand that none of what happened was my fault. Dad started coming to sessions with me, working through his own guilt and grief. Healing isn't linear, as Dr. Martinez often reminds us. There are still nights when I wake up in a panic, thinking I've forgotten to clean something. Days when I catch myself apologizing for taking up space. But those moments are getting rarer. Now, I'm finishing my senior year with straight A's, amazing what you can achieve when you actually have time to study. I've already been accepted to several colleges, and Dad insists I choose whichever one I want, regardless of cost. Sometimes I catch him looking at my acceptance letters with fierce pride. Last weekend, we had dinner at grandmother's house, like we do every Sunday now. As I watched Dad and his mother laughing together over old family stories, I realized something: sometimes families aren't broken beyond repair. Sometimes they just need the truth to come out, and the courage to face it.